สวัสดีค่ะกลับมาพบกับรายการ World Catch Up จับตากระแสโลกกับสำนักวิชาการระหว่างประเทศอีกครั้งหนึ่งนะคะเทปนี้จะเป็นเทปพิเศษค่ะเป็นเทปบันทึกการกล่าวปาฐกถาพิเศษของศาสตราจารย์กิตติคุณวิทิตมันตราภรณ์จากคณะนิติศาสตร์จุฬาลงกรณ์มหาวิทยาลัยซึ่งท่านเป็นผู้เชี่ยวชาญพิเศษด้านสิทธิมนุษยชนขององค์การสหประชาชาติด้วยค่ะการกล่าวปาฐกถาในครั้งนี้นะคะเป็นส่วนหนึ่งของการประชุมวิชาการนานาชาติชื่อ The International Security and the Environment ของคณะรัฐศาสตร์และรัฐประศาสนศาสตร์มหาวิทยาลัยเชียงใหม่ซึ่งปีนี้จัดเป็นครั้งที่ 4 แล้วนะคะภายใต้ธีม Politics and Power in Changing World การประชุมนานาชาติ International Security and the Environment เป็นงานประชุมวิชาการนานาชาติที่จัดขึ้นเป็นประจำทุกปีนะคะสำหรับท่านที่สนใจประเด็นใหม่ๆทางด้านการระหว่างประเทศหรือที่เกี่ยวข้องกับสิ่งแวดล้อมนะคะก็สามารถที่จะติดตามแล้วก็มานำเสนองานหรือว่ามาเข้าฟังเข้าร่วมกับกิจกรรมของเราได้นะคะอย่าลืมติดตามรายละเอียดใน Facebook ของคณะรัฐศาสตร์และรัฐประศาสนศาสตร์มหาวิทยาลัยเชียงใหม่ค่ะเชิญรับฟังและรับชมคลิปปาฐกถาพิเศษของศาสตราจารย์กิตติคุณวิทิตมันตราภรณ์ได้เลยค่ะขอบคุณค่ะ
Good morning everyone and a big hello to those who are online as well and congratulations to Chiang Mai University for this very timely topic and thank you very much for inviting me to join. It's always a pleasure to come to CMU and enjoy the environment and the wonderful friendships with many people here. So congratulations and a warm welcome. The topic that I thought I would do for you is what you see here, which is pathways to a sustainable environment, securing our shared future through human rights. And there's a PowerPoint which you're welcome to have. There's a sort of first draft of a paper which is subject to, they will be useful for you and to you in terms of discussion. What I'd like to do is to give a little presentation and then open up to question time towards the end of the 1 hour. And thank you very much for joining in. And please, particularly online, send in questions and so on. And I'll do my best to help and respond to you all. I think we're just waiting for a little technical addition there. Are you all right there up there? All right, very good. I think it's all fine. This is the topic at hand, and I thought about it, and I wanted to update you on many developments, not just in the legal field, but also the political side and the economic side, with which you are familiar to some extent, I think. And so the first element under this little topic is this: a scorching scenario or not. Disruption might be the poignant word to describe the geopolitical environment at the beginning of 2025, also impacting on the natural environment. Excessive nationalism and a reversion to more extractive and exploitative ways based on a transactional approach at the superpower level are part of that scorching scenario. The transcontinental political fever seems to be competing with the global atmospheric heat. This is mirrored by multipolarities whereby global fragmentation is taking its toll among exponents of multilateralism. Added to that, there is the polycrisis facing the world community in regard to the multitude of woes, many of which are related to armed conflicts on the one hand, and global warming and natural disasters on the other hand. This interlinks with the storm clouds, signaling that we are in the age of the Anthropocene, namely in the phase whereby human actions are having substantive impact on the environment. Impliedly, we are damaging the natural environment with its many elements, some of which are possibly beyond the potential to recover, to restore, and to be restored. It is thus easy to be despondent with the sentiment of dejection or a sense of despair in the face of such depredation. Yet, that scenario should not obscure the work at hand, which is to enable economic development to be well balanced with environmental protection in the pursuit of sustainability, bearing in mind the political and socio-cultural context. Environmental security, economic, political security, and human security are interdependent and mutually reinforcing siblings. With that ecosystem, the whole point of aiming for a sustainable environment is that it invites a longitudinal, long-term view with constructive efforts, even in the face of periodic pitfalls and potholes. People who believe in securing our shared future with us, our children, and posterity cannot yield in the face of adversity. Good examples and caring practices, especially at the horizontal community-based scale, can and do inspire us, even if at the vertical level of the state and interstate relations, there might be uncertainties and travesties. Despite that maelstrom, we will be resilient. Let us not forget what has been achieved to date. Since the Rio Declaration of the Global Community linking development and the environment in 1992, there have been a flurry of international agreements to help protect the environment of different sizes and ambitions. The Asian region has become very much part and parcel of that convergence, as seen by its broad participation in and ratification of multilateral environmental agreements, or MEAs, such as the UN Framework, UN Convention on Climate Change, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. And in my paper, I did a table for you empirically showing that there's a huge number of countries from Asia which are parties to all these agreements. So, standard setting has been important to enable a universality of norms to guide actions, while of course the issue of effective implementation remains a persistent concern. At the regional level, the various organizations which bring countries together in the Asian panorama cannot and do not avoid the issue of the environment and have offered some key actions. For instance, a catalytic treaty in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, is the ASEAN Agreement on Transboundary Haze Pollution, most pertinent for tackling the transfrontier fumes polluting parts of the region. Nearby, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a security-oriented entity, declared 2024 as its year of ecology, thus promoting cooperation on green growth, low-carbon development, and greenhouse gas reduction through responsive technologies. At the national level, all countries have a variety of laws and policies which can protect the environment, even though, again, the key is enforcement. Certain principles of global import have emerged to propel the international community and in addressing risks and threats to the security of the environment. Of key importance is the precautionary principle whereby preventive action should be taken to counter potential harm, even where the scientific data are not altogether clear. There is also emphasis on flexibility to help developing countries and communities. While it is true that we are faced with the triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and loss of biodiversity, signs of progress are visible on some fronts. For instance, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which sets the ground rules for protecting global diversity, is now complemented by the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which targets by 2050 the reduction of threats to biodiversity with a more people-oriented outlook, shaped by benefit sharing and equity, with supportive financing to halt human-induced extinction of threatened species. In relation to pollution, there is now greater impetus to control plastic pollution by means of a potential new international treaty aimed at upstream, midstream, and downstream activities so as to enable a circular economy to overcome waste. In regard to maritime marine pollution, the recent adoption of the so-called High Seas Treaty enables conservation of marine biodiversity, accompanied by anti-pollution safeguards through designated protection areas with international and regional monitoring. Business activities therein will be subject to due diligence measures and scrutiny under various oversight mechanisms. With regard to climate change and global warming, according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, at least 182 countries now have targets to ensure renewable energy across all sectors in the nationally determined contributions evolved as their inputs for the Paris Agreement. This helps with defossilization and decarbonization. Recent years have seen a quantum leap, especially in Asia, to produce electric vehicles, electric batteries, and photovoltaic panels for solar energy, at times with such success that there is a backlash from other regions of the globe with ensuing tariff walls to prevent the incoming flood of goods. Of course, more needs to be done on the adaptation angle of global local action to enable countries to adapt to the changing environment and the various risks, such as natural disasters, which loom in that setting. Significantly, the role of indigenous peoples as guardians of nature and biodiversity is now recognized through that global process, enabling a community-based approach to be valued, as well as solutions based on nature and its guardians to have a key role in the global local governance. Nearer home, a timely question for Thailand is this: can we resort to indigenous knowledge and wisdom to help our farmers avoid monoculture or to convert the stubble of rice and sugarcane into compost so that they can avoid burning the fields with fumes spreading from rural to urban areas and beyond? Intriguingly, a mere legal order from the authorities to stop the burning will not necessarily do the trick, but assisting and incentivizing farmers to adjust their ways cost-effectively and wisely may help to do so, particularly with empathy. These constructive developments are identified not to justify complacency, nor to exaggerate global confidence. Rather, they exemplify that some measures are possible even in the face of major intransigence. They are shaped by the call to broaden stakeholders and partnerships and to enable different scales of operationalization, not merely macroscopic, but also microscopic in terms of smaller scale enterprises and initiatives to foster more bottom-up initiatives. And there are openings and opportunities. At this juncture, 3 other openings offering opportunities should be underlined. First, there are the Global Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, 2015 to 30, and their 17 goals, many of which interplay with a sustainable environment, complemented by various measurement tools and indicators which track the work in progress. There has been universal buy-in by the international community, including Asia, which attests to a degree of international convergence. For example, SDG Goal 13 is on climate action, and it is closely related to action against global warming as represented by the Paris Agreement. The latest SDG Monitoring Report 2025, which came out just last week from ESCAP, the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, highlights the following items as challenges to be addressed, bearing in mind that there has been least progress in implementing SDG Goal 13 on climate action. And the challenges, as noted by ESCAP last week, include the following: water-related ecosystems, share of renewable energy, material resource efficiency, resilience of humans and others to disasters, sustainable use of natural resources, climate change policies, marine resources for small island developing states and least developed countries, and loss of biodiversity. While indications are that the world will not attain those goals by 2030, the monitoring process has at least ensured that the situation is more transparent and grounded in credible data gathering and related monitoring, rather than mere advocacy. The climate change phenomenon has benefited from the impetus due to the Conference of State Parties, known as the COP, under the Paris Agreement, which have provided room for consistent negotiations of a progressive kind. The most recent COP opened the door to more action on climate adaptation measures as well as climate change. And this year, of course, we'll head to Brazil, to Belém, for the new COP. A sense of balance and fair play is thus advocated even if one or two major players withdraw. Third, in 2024, the global community managed to congregate to adopt a forward-looking vision in the form of the Pact for the Future and the Declaration on Future Generations and the Global Digital Compact, which are all interwoven with the issue of environmental sustainability. In particular, the Pact for the Future underlines many linchpins for environmental action. I cite one or two as examples. Note, to triple the renewable energy capacity globally by 2030, phase down coal power, accelerate net zero emission energy systems with zero and low carbon by 2050, and encouragement to implement all the multilateral environmental agreements. The Declaration on Future Generations helps to underline the role of youth as key stakeholders in the pathways to the future, while the Global Digital Compact opens the door to utilize digitalization and artificial intelligence, AI, to assist with environmental protection and conservation. An interesting double-edged sword is the fact that the AI itself uses a lot of electricity and may be responsible for major emissions, which also need to be tracked and attenuated, while its generative nature may impel some solutions of a constructive kind or destructive kind. How then can human rights provide a value added to help with enabling sustainable environment? What about the human rights perspectives? A human rights-based approach advocates a person's or a community's entitlements, what is due to us, what we claim, vis-a-vis the state, at least vis-a-vis the state. There are universal standards based on non-discrimination to support that premise, such as via human rights treaties and the UN Charter and related mechanisms. Importantly, the range of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights are interrelated and indivisible. In ordinary jargon, for example, the right to food, an economic right, is interwoven with the right to comment on the quality of the food, a political right, due to the expression angle. The one needs the other to ensure that there is no political indigestion. Interestingly, therefore, a sustainable environment is closely linked with not only human rights, but also democracy and peace. The state is under three obligations, namely, the duty to respect human rights and not regress, the duty to protect the rights holders from third-party impingement, and the duty to fulfill such rights, for example, to commit resources to facilitate realization of the rights concerned. The state is thus called upon to have at least good laws, policies, and practices to implement those rights. The human rights-based approach has seeped constructively into the SDGs and was also mentioned more recently in the Kunming-Montreal framework. Action to promote and protect sustainable environment should thus not be based on a charitable discretionary approach from the state, but be based on the three named obligations towards rights holders, particularly individuals and communities, namely the duties to respect, protect, and fulfill. Undergirding human rights, the principle of non-discrimination integrates a gender perspective to counter disparities as well as equity concerns, to overcome poverty and to share resources more fairly. Meanwhile, the fact that the principle advocates the protection of all persons on a state's territory, irrespective of a person's origins, implies at least basic minimum protection for all persons, including non-nationals, such as refugees and stateless persons. Vulnerabilities are borne in mind to cater flexibility to women, children, migrants, minorities, indigenous peoples, and persons with disabilities. The graying of Asia will also need increasingly special provisions for seniors. That human rights approach was strengthened in 2022 by the adoption in the United Nations General Assembly of the UN Declaration on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. Right to environment. Basically, there are two key tenets of this right to a healthy environment, that is. One, procedural rights, and two, substantive rights. The former, the procedural angle, advocates access to information and participation of concerned groups, such as through public hearings and environmental and human rights impact assessment, prior to the finalization and implementation of projects and programs affecting the environment, with mitigation measures. Substantive rights cover such elements as enjoyment of the basics of life, for instance, healthcare, education, food, nutrition, shelter, and adequate standard of living, linked with water, clean water, air, climate quality, and possession of land, such as respect for ancestral land of indigenous peoples. If there are violations or transgressions, there should be access to remedies, and this may include formal remedies such as access to the courts, or informal remedies such as access to mediation and negotiation. The redress can be varied, such as compensation, restitution of resources to the rights holders, apologies, and even a promise not to repeat the wrongdoing. A former Prime Minister of Thailand went to southern Thailand recently to apologize. Vulnerabilities such as gender, age, ethnicity, and displacement should be well reflected in responsive actions. Actions on this front are linked with access to justice, and more particularly on climate change, climate justice. In this crucible, two catalysts have emerged as key determinants today, in addition to the state itself, namely, 1, the business sector, and 2, future generations, particularly youth. Another key development is in regard to the role and responsibility of the business sector in the human rights field. Under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, it is the state that has the duty to protect, such as through the formulation of laws and policies on environmental protection and labor rights. The business sector has the duty to respect human rights under that framework, and it is called upon to adopt due diligence measures to assess risks and to mitigate the potential harm, thus interlinked with a rounded notion of security. If damage ensues in this framework, there is the duty to remedy the situation, and it is a duty shared between the state and the business sector. In real terms, the duty of the state is often an obligation of conduct to adopt laws and policies and ensure their implementation with all available resources, while the state is not necessarily accountable for the damage from all forms of the pollution. The latter may be linked with the responsibility of the business sector, depending upon proof of causation. A couple of examples of the exercise of this right to a safe environment, or a clean environment, healthy environment rather, can be seen from the Asian region. In Thailand, for instance, there have been many court cases on pollution. In one case, the so-called Kliti Creek case, the local community was harmed by pollution in a water source caused by a company's factory nearby. The provincial authorities had failed to adopt adequate safeguards to compel the business sector to take precautions against the pollution. The case was dealt with by two courts. The administrative court found the authorities liable for the omission, and various damages compensation were awarded. Then action was taken against the company in a civil court, separately from the admin court, for the actual pollution, and the court ordered damages on the basis of the pollution. In a manner, the authorities were in breach of the obligation of conduct to adopt measures to regulate possible action by the company. While the authorities were in breach of the obligation of the conduct, while the company was in breach of the obligation of result in causing the pollution itself. A similar case on climate change and air pollution, many of which actually affect Chiang Mai, appeared recently, when the authorities were found to be liable for not having a register for pollution-related emissions from factories. This was differentiated from the other issue, namely the cause of the pollution itself, and the court did not attribute the latter to the authorities. Interestingly, Many of these cases emanate from public interest litigation initiated by concerned groups who are not necessarily the direct victims of transgressions. Regrettably, however, there are also several cases where either the authorities or the business sector have prosecuted or litigated against civil society members and non-governmental organizations, when the latter complain against mishaps linked with the environment. These cases are known as SLAP cases, namely strategic litigation against public participation, and they are intended to intimidate groups through action in regard to their expression and concerns. In other words, to shut the space for expression. There should thus be more space for constructive criticism without the risk of so-called reverse litigation or prosecution, which dampens the right to freedom of expression and the work of human rights defenders and related environmentalists. Finally, there is the intergenerational issue, which has come to the fore more strongly with recent cases which connect well with the noted Declaration on Future Generations. How are the young to have a greater say in environmental protection? In a famous case in one developed country, in one of its states under the federal system, a group of young people litigated against the authorities for not having environmental impact assessment in regard to activities affecting climate change. The court found in favor of the youthful group and awarded compensation to them. These are tiny ripples to press the state and the business sector to show a sense of responsibility for the omission or inaction or action causing the harm itself. While such litigation and related pressures are not always successful, they can be a vigilant means of leveraging for responsiveness from those actors which have impact on the environment. The human rights perspective thus enables the issue of justice to be raised through advocacy for transformative change, as well as accountability and responsive governance. We could conclude, perhaps, by noting that this quest has moved upwards to the multilateral level through casework in the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, for short, ITLOS, set up by a multilateral environmental agreement, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which has now issued its advice on the question of greenhouse gases and marine pollution. Recently, the International Court of Justice, namely the World Court, was also requested to advise on the issue of the obligations of states in regard to climate change. Let's see what ITLOS, the Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, advised very recently to the global community. It advised as follows. 1. States parties to the Law of the Sea Convention have the specific obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment from climate change impacts and ocean acidification. Where the marine environment has been degraded, this obligation may call for measures to restore marine habitats and ecosystems. 2. This obligation is one of due diligence, and due diligence usually means you must have environmental impact assessment and mitigation measures. The standard of due diligence is stringent, given the high risks of serious and irreversible harm to the marine environment from climate change impacts and ocean acidification. And 3, states parties have the specific obligation to take appropriate measures to prevent, reduce, and control pollution. And the obligation requires the application of the precautionary approach. In regard to the awaited World Court advice, it is still awaited, but what is interesting is that for the first time, I think in Thailand's history, Thailand has made a submission on its perspective in regard to climate change, which you can find on the internet. Thailand is there providing its advice to the World Court before the World Court provides its advice to the world community for once. In other words, the state should show that it has taken measures in accordance with its capabilities and available resources to address the issue. We can almost guess that the World Court will soon reflect and build upon the advice from the Sea Link Tribunal for more general international cum national application. Finally, what about some intergenerational enablers? In some, we should be perspicacious and resourceful in urging action to protect the environment and ensure its sustainability by means of a range of actions and stakeholders. It is also a matter of dealing with power and prevention of abuse of power, and there are some key messages of relevance. First, multilateralism is not and should not be dead. The various multilateral treaties and commitments still need implementation, and even if one or two superpowers jump ship, middle powers and smaller scale nations need to coalesce well to fill in gaps through concerted actions. Second, regional systems need to be reinforced on environmental protection, especially to tackle transfrontier issues. A key case in point in Southeast Asia, for example, not far from here, is to enable upstream, midstream and downstream cooperation to be well concretized, such as in the Mekong sub-region, to minimize the harm, especially in regard to those ubiquitous dams. Third, the various laws and policy frameworks at the national level need more effective implementation, and the human rights-based approach can provide a value added to propel more guarantees in relation to the procedural and substantive elements interlinking with access to remedies and justice, taking into account various vulnerabilities. This must be coupled with a broad educational and lifelong socialization process, and happily, of course, in Chiang Mai University itself, to protect the environment, especially from a young age, coupled with pro bono community-oriented activities and cross-cultural programs which nurture empathy through responsive action. We should add to the caption, learn by doing, we should add the spiritual dimension and caption of earn merit by helping. Fourth, more stakeholders need to be brought on board, including the business sector, and with due diligence and risk cum harm mitigation measures, and youth through their integration in policy planning, implementation, and evaluation, such as through youth councils. We have youth councils all over Thailand, including in Chiang Mai, which need more say in policy making at the local and national levels. There should be more space for local communities and indigenous peoples to help as guardians of the environment in a less centralized setting and with a more inclusive and sharing mindset. And fifth, more room should be guaranteed to civil society, organizations and individuals to engage critically in the development process so that they can help to be a check and balance against excesses without fear of retaliation or the slap. There is potential for more public interest litigation to leverage for changes and accountable governance. Likewise, there is much leeway for the identification and utilization of local wisdom invigorated by proactive dissemination. Thus, our strategy should be to utilize all the instruments in the toolbox. Good laws, or if they're bad laws, don't use them, even before reform, please. Good laws, policies, programs, practices, resources, material and non-material, such as pro bono contribution and spiritual inputs, mechanisms, personnel, education, data and monitoring, technology, leadership, remedies and accountability, networking, and cooperation as catalysts for change. These would be, thus, a comprehensive portal for enablers and not inhibitors. Our task is heartened, surely by being in Chiang Mai, it is heartened by recent options, step by step, to advocate and proffer the preferred pathways realistically, persistently, and astutely. It is an elevating and elevated challenge for our togetherness and solidarity to mitigate the pain and to alleviate that strain with a glimmer of light somewhere above, transcending the socio-political chasm. Humbly, steeped in that spirit of a shared narrative, we might even call this the synergy and perspective paradox. No, perspective paradigm of intergenerational hope. Thank you very much.